The campsite was already there when we found it, and it had been there long enough that the fire pit was cold, but not long enough that the coffee in the tin cup had finished going to mold. I have thought about that detail for almost 20 years now. The coffee. Black, half full, sitting on a flat stone beside the fire pit, with a thin grey skin floating on the surface and the faintest trace of frost around the rim where the night cold had touched it. Whoever had left that cup down had left it down recently enough that the coffee had not yet evaporated, recently enough that the cup itself was still upright, untouched by the wind that had been blowing through that drainage since well before dawn. My name is not the one I use professionally. I have changed it for this account, at the request of the 2 men who were with me that week, who are both still living and who would prefer that the events of those 4 days not be associated with their real names. I'm going to call myself Daniel. I'm going to call my friends Bart and Wes. The location, the season, and the work we were doing on the trip I have left as accurate as I can manage, because the specific shape of the country matters to what happened. In the late summer of 2006, the 3 of us took a week of backcountry permits in the northwest section of Yellowstone, in an area that runs along the boundary between the park and the Gallatin National Forest. It is a piece of country that does not see heavy traffic. The trails through it are real trails, maintained on the park side and less so on the forest side, but the country between them is open and difficult, and most visitors to Yellowstone never come within 20 miles of where we were. Bart was a wildlife biologist with the state of Montana. Wes worked for a small surveying firm out of Bozeman. I was, at the time, a regional editor for an outdoor magazine that no longer exists, and the trip had been arranged with the loose idea that I might write something about the lesser-known drainages of the northern park. None of us were strangers to the country. Bart had done his graduate fieldwork in the upper Lamar Valley. Wes had spent 2 summers running survey lines through similar terrain. I had been hiking in Yellowstone since I was a teenager. We were not weekend campers. We knew what we were doing. The first 3 days of the trip were uneventful in the way that good trips are uneventful. We covered ground at a steady pace. We saw elk in the early mornings. We saw a single grizzly at distance on the second afternoon working a hillside about a quarter mile across a meadow from us, and we waited politely for it to move on before we crossed where it had been. The weather held. The nights were cold, but not bitter. We were doing the kind of trip where the country itself was the point, and the country was being generous. On the 4th morning, we came down off a ridge into a small, unnamed drainage that ran roughly south-southwest, fed by a creek that was unmarked on our quad. The drainage was not on any of our planned routes. We had taken a contour line down it because Bart had spotted what he thought might be wolf sign on the way over the ridge, and he wanted to follow it for an hour before we picked our planned trail back up. The campsite sat in a small flat about a mile down the creek on the south bank, in a stand of lodgepole pine. Bart saw it first. He stopped walking and held up his hand, and the 3 of us looked through the trees at what was in front of us, and for a long moment none of us said anything. It was a real campsite, a proper one. Not a quick overnight bivouac and not a hunter's wallow, but a place that someone had taken time setting up. There was a canvas-walled tent pitched neatly on a level patch of ground, the kind of tent that outfitters use, with a small metal stove jack on the roof and the guy lines all tied off square. There was a fire pit ringed with stones, ash gone gray and cold. There was a folding camp table set up beside the fire pit, with a tin cup on it and a tin plate and a small enamel pot. There was a stack of cut wood, neatly arranged. There was a canvas tarp strung between 2 trees, serving as a cook fly, with rain runoff channels cut into the dirt below it, the way you cut them when you mean to stay somewhere a while. And there was no one there. We stood at the edge of the trees and we waited, the way you wait when you come unexpected onto another person's space in the backcountry. We called out twice, then a 3rd time. We listened. The creek ran behind us. A raven moved through the pines somewhere uphill. There was no answer. Wes was the one who said it. He said, Somebody's coming back. They've left their camp. It was the obvious explanation. People do leave their camps. They hike for the day. They fish the creek. They go up a side drainage and come back at dusk. We had been carrying our own packs all morning, and the idea of an empty camp at midday was not strange in itself. But we had not seen anyone on our way down. There had been no fresh boot prints on the trail we had come down. There had been no horse sign, no mule sign. The campsite was an outfitter setup, the kind of camp that takes pack animals to establish, and there was no corral, no highline, no manure pile, no sign that animals had ever been in the flat at all. Bart walked carefully around the perimeter of the camp without entering it. I went with him. Wes stayed at the trees, his pack still on, watching the country uphill. The tent flap was tied closed from the outside. That was the first thing we noticed. You do not tie your tent closed from the outside if you mean to come back to it that afternoon. You tie it closed from the outside if you are leaving for a long time or if you have left for good. It is a small distinction, but it is the kind of thing that registers when you have spent enough time in the backcountry. The fire pit was cold. Bart held his hand over the ashes and shook his head. Not warm, not even faintly warm. The fire had been out for a while, a night at least. Possibly longer. The folding table was where I saw the coffee. The tin cup was sitting on the table, upright, half full. The coffee inside was old enough to have gone bad. There was a thin grey skin on the surface, and the faint mineral ring around the inside of the cup where the level had dropped through evaporation, but the coffee was still wet, still liquid, still recognizable as coffee. I have spent a fair part of my life sitting around backcountry fires, and I can tell you, with reasonable confidence, that a tin cup of coffee left out in the open in late August in the Yellowstone high country will dry to a brown ring in about 2 days. It will be entirely gone by the 3rd. The coffee in that cup had been there longer than overnight, and less time than 3 days. 2 days, maybe. 2.5. I told Bart what I was looking at. He came over and looked at the cup. He looked at the small bowl beside it, which had what appeared to be the dried remains of oatmeal in it. He looked at the spoon lying across the bowl, with the bowl side down against the dried oatmeal. He said, very quietly, they were eating breakfast. Wes called over from the trees. He had been watching us, and he had been watching the country, and he asked us, in a careful voice, whether we had checked inside the tent. We had not. Bart untied the flap. He did it slowly, the way you handle other people's property, and he called out once more before he opened it. There was no answer. He pulled the flap aside and looked in. The tent was set up to live in. There were 2 cots inside, both made with wool blankets folded neatly at the foot of each. There was a small folding chair. There was a kerosene lantern on a milk crate that had been turned on end to serve as a side table. There was a duffel bag at the foot of one of the cots, open with clothes inside. There was a leather rifle case leaning in the corner. The case was empty. There were 2 backpacks against the back wall of the tent, 2 pairs of boots, 2 coats hanging from a line strung along the inside ridge. 2 of everything. Bart did not enter the tent. He let the flap fall closed and he stepped back, and the 3 of us stood at the edge of the trees and we looked at each other and we did not say anything for a while. Wes broke the silence. He said, 2 people walked out of here without their packs and without their boots. That was when the morning began to feel different. I want to say something here, because I have told this story a small number of times over the years, and I have come to understand that people who have not spent serious time in the wilderness do not always understand what was wrong with what we found. They think of a missing person as someone who got lost on a day hike, or who got hurt and could not get back. Those things happen. Those things have explanations. People wander off trail. People fall. People underestimate the weather. But when an experienced outfitter camp sits abandoned in deep backcountry, with the breakfast dishes still on the table and the rifle missing from its case and the boots still inside the tent. What you are looking at is not a backcountry accident. You are looking at something that does not have a name. A person who falls and dies has their boots on. A person who gets attacked by an animal leaves blood and gear and signs of struggle. A person who decides to walk out for help packs what they need and takes their boots and probably their coat. A person who has a stroke or a heart attack is found near where they fell. Two people in stockinged feet, with one of them carrying a rifle, do not walk away from a breakfast table into open Yellowstone backcountry in late August. Not voluntarily. Not by any explanation that the three of us could imagine standing in that clearing. Bart was the most careful of us. He was the one who said what we were going to do. He said we were going to do three things. We were going to walk a wide perimeter around the camp, looking for tracks. We were going to mark our GPS coordinates and the campsite location precisely. And then we were going to walk back up to the main trail, and we were going to hike out, and we were going to report what we had found to the rangers at the nearest station, which was probably 2 days away on foot. We did not discuss searching for the missing campers ourselves. None of us suggested it. I think, looking back, that this was because we already understood, in a way we had not yet put into words, that whatever had happened in that flat was not the kind of thing the three of us were going to solve by walking into the woods around it. The perimeter walk took about 40 minutes. Wes and Bart did it together. I stayed at the camp, sitting on a rock about 30 feet from the fire pit, with my pack on the ground beside me. And I watched the camp the way you watch something you do not want to take your eyes off of. While I was sitting there, I noticed three things. The first was that there were no insects on the food. The oatmeal in the bowl, the coffee in the cup, the small smear of grease on the tin plate, all of it was untouched. In the back country in August, food left out for 2 days will be covered in flies and ants within hours. There were no flies on the oatmeal. There were no ants on the plate. There was nothing crawling on anything. The second was that the wood stacked beside the fire pit had been cut with an axe, not split, and it had been cut very recently. The cuts were clean, and the wood was still pale at the cut faces, not yet darkened from exposure. Whoever had cut that wood had cut it within the last few days, probably within the last day or two before they disappeared. The third was harder to put into words at the time, and I have only really understood it in retrospect. The camp was too quiet. There was no sound from inside the tent, no flap of canvas, no creak of cot. Nothing you would expect from an empty structure in a light breeze. The cook fly, strung between the 2 trees, did not move. The pots on the table did not stir. The whole flat had a stillness to it that was not the stillness of a camp without people. It was the stillness of a camp where something else was paying attention. I do not know how to describe that better than that. I'm aware that it sounds like the kind of thing people say in stories. But I sat on that rock for 40 minutes. And the longer I sat there, the more certain I became that I was not alone. Not in any way I could prove, not in any way I could have explained to a ranger, but the country around that camp was holding its breath, and the camp itself was the center of whatever was being held. When Bart and Wes came back from the perimeter walk, Bart's face was different than it had been when he left. He told me, in a quiet voice, what they had found. They had found 2 sets of tracks leaving the camp on the upstream side of the creek. The tracks were sock-foot, no boots. The 2 people had walked out of camp in their socks, side by side, heading west along the creek bank, into a section of timber that climbed steeply toward an unnamed ridge. The tracks were undisturbed, no drag marks, no signs of struggle, no animal prints alongside them. Just 2 people walking calmly in their socks into country that no sane person walks into without boots. The tracks went about 300 yards from the camp before they entered a rocky section where the ground was hard and the prints did not register. Bart and Wes had followed them as far as they could, and then they had stopped because the country beyond the rocks went up steeply into dead fall, and they were not willing to follow without knowing what they were following toward. Wes told me, while Bart was checking the GPS, That on the way back to camp, he had looked up the slope on the south side of the creek, the side opposite the tracks, and he had seen something at the top of the timber. I asked him what. He said he did not know. He said it was the wrong shape for an elk and the wrong color for a bear, and it had been standing perfectly still about 200 yards uphill in the shadow of a stand of pines, and it had been watching the camp. He said by the time he had thought to call out to Bart, it was gone. I asked him how it had gone. He said it had not run, it had not walked away. He had looked at it, and looked at Bart, and looked back, and it was simply not there anymore. We left the campsite about 20 minutes later. We did not touch anything. We did not enter the tent. We did not move the coffee cup. We marked the location, photographed what we could without disturbing the site, and we walked out of that drainage at a steady pace, not quite hurrying, but not stopping either. We did not talk for the first hour of the walk out. There was nothing to say. We made it back to our planned trail by evening. We made cold camp that night, no fire, the three of us close together in a single small clearing. We took turns staying awake. None of us slept well. It took us 2 more days to hike out to the trailhead. When we got there, we drove to the nearest ranger station and we reported what we had found. The rangers took the report seriously. They asked good questions. They wrote down the GPS coordinates. They told us that a team would be sent in within 24 hours. We gave them our contact information and we drove back to Bozeman and we waited. 3 weeks later, Bart called me. He had spoken to a contact of his at the Park Service. The ranger team had reached the campsite. They had found the tent. They had found the fire pit. They had found the cook fly and the table and the wood pile. They had not found the tin cup or the bowl or the spoon or any sign that the camp had been occupied. They had not found tracks leading away. The ranger Bart spoke to was professional and careful. He said that backcountry sites are sometimes disturbed by wildlife, that bears in particular will rearrange and remove small items, that wind and weather can do strange things in 2 weeks. He said there was no missing persons report that matched the camp. He said no outfitter in the region had reported a lost client or a lost camp. He said they would maintain a file on the location and would check it again in the spring. Bart asked him about the rifle in the case. The ranger said the team had not seen a rifle case. There had been no firearms-related evidence at the site. Bart asked him about the boots. The ranger said the tent had been empty. No boots, no coats, no duffel bag, no backpacks. The tent itself had been there. Just the tent. Standing alone in the flap tied closed from the outside the way we had left it. I want to be careful about what I claim, because I am aware that memory plays tricks, and I am aware that 3 witnesses can produce 3 different accounts of the same event. But Bart and Wes and I have talked about that morning many times over the years, and we agree on the details. We agree on the cup of coffee, we agree on the oatmeal, we agree on the boots and the rifle case and the duffel bag and the 2 coats hanging from the line inside the tent. We agree on the tracks leading away in stocking feet. We agree on what Wes saw on the far slope. Whatever was in that camp before we arrived had been removed by the time the rangers got there. Whether it was removed by the people who came back for it, or by the country itself, or by something that was watching from the timber while we sat in the clearing, I cannot tell you. I do not know. I want to say one more thing. In the years since that trip, I have continued to spend time in the backcountry. Not as much as I used to. I have found, as I have gotten older, that I prefer trips with more people and shorter distances, and country that does not require permits to enter. I tell myself this is the natural drift of middle age. Maybe it is. But there are certain kinds of stillness that I no longer tolerate. When I am in the wilderness and the wind drops and the birds go quiet and the trees stop moving, I notice it now in a way that I did not notice it before. I stand up. I look around. I make sure I know where my partners are. I make sure I have not somehow become the only one paying attention. I have never told this story to my children. They're grown now, and they know I camped in Yellowstone when they were young, and they have seen the photographs from those trips, the ones from before that fourth morning. They do not need to know about the cup of coffee. They do not need to know about the tracks in stocking feet. But I tell it sometimes to other people who have spent serious time in the country. I tell it to them because I want them to know what we found, and because I want them to know that the rangers found nothing, and because I want them to understand, before they go out into deep country alone, that the wilderness occasionally does things that do not fit into the categories we have for it. 2 people walked out of a camp in their socks in late August of 2006 in the northwest corner of Yellowstone, and they did not come back. The tin cup of coffee they left behind sat on the table for at least 2 days before 3 of us came across it. The boots were still inside the tent. The rifle was missing from its case. Something was standing on a slope 200 yards uphill. And then it was not. I do not know what happened to those 2 people. I do not know whether they were found, eventually, by some search that we never heard about, or whether they are still up there somewhere, in country that does not give back what it takes. I only know that we found their camp, and that the coffee was still wet, and that the silence of that clearing has stayed with me in a quiet corner of my memory for almost 20 years now, every time the wind drops in a place where the wind ought not to drop. Story 2. There is a particular ranger station in the South District of Yellowstone where I worked for 2 summers, in 1998 and 1999, and there is a logbook in that station that I have thought about every winter for the last 25 years. My name is Curtis. I have changed my last name for this account, and I have changed the names of the 2 co-workers I am going to mention, because both of them have asked me to keep their involvement private. The station I am going to describe is real, and it is still in use, though the building has been renovated twice since my time there. The events I'm going to tell you about took place across a 6-week period in the late summer and early fall of 1999, and they involved a logbook that was kept in a back room behind the dispatch desk, and a series of entries in that logbook that I cannot, even now, entirely explain. I was 26 years old that summer. I had taken the seasonal ranger position the year before after finishing a degree in forestry, and I was working under a district supervisor named Hal, who had been with the Park Service for 19 years and who treated me, as he treated all of his summer staff, with a kind of patient skepticism that gradually warmed into something like respect by the end of each season. The station was a 5-person posting. We covered a wide stretch of country, mostly in support of campground operations, trail maintenance, and the occasional search and rescue. It was good work. It was the work I had hoped for when I finished school. The logbook in question was a green canvas-bound ledger that sat on a shelf in the back room behind the radio dispatch desk. It was not the operational logbook. The operational logbook was kept at the dispatch desk itself in the front room, and it was used to record incoming radio traffic, visitor incidents, and the daily activities of the rangers in the field. The green logbook in the back room was something different. It was older. It dated back, as best I could tell, to the early 1970s, and it had been kept continuously by every ranger who had worked the station since then. The entries in it were sparse, sometimes only 1 or 2 a year, but they were specific in a way that the operational log was not, and they were written in a tone that did not match the rest of the station's paperwork. Hal called it the backlog. He showed it to me on my second day at the station in the summer of 1998, and he sat me down at the small wooden table in the back room, and he told me, in a measured voice, that the back log was where rangers at this station recorded observations that did not fit into the regular reporting structure. I asked him what kind of observations. He thought about the answer for a long moment before he gave it. Then he said that the back log was where you wrote down the things you saw that you did not want to put into the official record, but that you also did not want to forget. He said it was the kind of record that helped the next ranger who saw something similar feel less alone. He said I should read it when I had time, and that I should add to it if I needed to, and that I should not show it to visitors or to anyone outside the Park Service. He did not elaborate. He did not seem to want to. I read the backlog over the course of my first summer. It took me a while because the entries were scattered through the ledger in no particular order, and because some of them were quite long and others were only a sentence or two. There were entries about lights seen in the Mirror Plateau area at hours when no traffic should have been there. There were entries about radio anomalies on the South District frequency in the early morning hours. There were entries about a particular section of trail in the Bekla region where a number of rangers, over a period of years, had reported the same feeling of being followed by something they could not see and could not identify by sound. The entries were professional. They did not exaggerate. They read like the field notes of careful people who had seen something they could not categorize, and who had wanted to leave a record for the person who came after them. I did not add to the log during my first summer. I did not see anything I felt warranted an entry. But I read it carefully, and I asked Hal questions about some of the older entries, and I came away from that first season with the understanding that the backlog was a kind of inheritance. A quiet inheritance, passed from one ranger to the next, that acknowledged certain things about working in deep wilderness that the official record had no place for. In the second summer, I made my own entry. It was the third week of September. The season was winding down. The campgrounds were thinning out, the trails were quieter, and the daily routine at the station had settled into the rhythm it always settled into at the end of the year. Hal had taken 3 days off to drive his wife to a wedding in Helena. The station was being run by myself and another ranger, a woman named Lee, who was a year older than me and who had worked at the station for 3 seasons. Lee was competent and careful, and was, I think, the best ranger I worked with in either of the 2 summers I spent there. On the night of September 23rd, at approximately 2:30 in the morning, we received a call on the South District frequency. I was on dispatch that night. Lee was asleep in the back bunk room. The radio had been quiet for several hours. I was reading at the desk, drinking weak coffee, when the speaker came to life with a burst of static and then a voice. The voice was male. It was calm. It did not give a call sign. It said, "South Station, this is reporting from Grid 17. We have a situation." I keyed the mic and I asked the caller to identify himself. There was a pause. Then the voice said, "We have a situation at the campsite. We need you to come up." I asked again for identification. Standard protocol. Any caller on the operational frequency was required to identify themselves by name and unit before any further communication. The voice did not identify. It said, "Curtis, we need you to come up." I sat at the desk for a long moment after that. The voice had used my name. There were perhaps a dozen people in the Park Service South District who knew my name. None of them would have called in on the operational frequency at 2:30 in the morning without identifying themselves. None of them would have refused to identify themselves when asked. I keyed the mic and I asked the caller, one more time, to state his name and his unit. The voice did not answer. The frequency went back to its normal carrier hum. I sat with the mic in my hand for another minute. Then I put it down, and I walked back to the bunk room and I woke Lee. Lee was a calm person. She did not startle. I told her what I had heard. She listened all the way through, and then she came out to the dispatch desk and she sat down with me and she asked me to play back the recording. The station's radio system recorded all operational frequency traffic on a continuous loop. The recording was used for documentation in case of incidents that required follow-up. I rewound the recording to the time of the call. There was no call on the recording. The frequency carrier hum was there. The timestamp was correct. The 2:30 mark was clearly audible. But there was no voice, no static burst, no "South Station, this is reporting from Grid 17. Nothing. Lee looked at me for a long moment. She did not say anything dismissive. She did not suggest I'd been half asleep, or that I had imagined it. She simply asked me to write up what I had heard, exactly as I had heard it, while it was still fresh in my mind. I wrote it up. I gave the page to her. She read it carefully. Then she got up and walked to the back room and came back with the green logbook. She set it on the dispatch desk in front of me. She opened it to a clean page. She handed me a pen. She said, "This is for the backlog." I wrote the entry. I included the time, the frequency, the exact words of the voice as I remembered them, and the fact that the call did not appear on the operational recording. I wrote it in the same careful, restrained tone that the previous entries in the backlog had been written in. When I was done, I signed it with my name and the date, the way the other entries had been signed, and I closed the book. Lee took the book back to the shelf in the back room. Neither of us slept the rest of that night. We sat in the dispatch room together with the lights on and the radio on low, and we did not talk much, and we waited for morning. The next day, Lee did something that I did not know she was going to do. She took the backlog down off the shelf, and she sat at the wooden table in the back room and she read through the entire ledger from front to back. She had been at the station for 3 seasons. She had read parts of the backlog before, but she had never, she told me later, read it from the beginning straight through to the end. When Hal came back 2 days later, Lee asked him to sit down with her, and she showed him what she had found. The backlog contained, by Lee's count, 11 entries that referenced unidentified voices on the South District operational frequency. The earliest one was from 1974. The most recent one, before mine, was from 1991. The entries were spread across that span unevenly, sometimes years apart, but they all shared certain features. The voices were always male. The voices were always calm. The voices always called in late at night, between midnight and 4 in the morning. The voices never gave proper identification when asked. And the voices always, eventually, used the name of the ranger who was on dispatch that night. Lee had circled the entries on a separate piece of paper and listed the rangers' names beside them. She showed the paper to Hal. He read it slowly, and his face did not change, but he sat back in his chair when he was finished, and he looked out the window for a while before he said anything. Then he told us what he knew. He said that he had received one of the calls himself in 1986 during his first year at the station. He said he had been on dispatch overnight, and the call had come in at approximately 3:15 in the morning, and the voice had used his name, and the call had not appeared on the operational recording. He had made his entry in the back log the next day. He had not spoken about it to anyone outside the station since. He said that, as far as he knew, no ranger who had received one of these calls had ever come to harm because of it. He said there had been no documented case of a ranger going up into the country in response to one of the calls and finding anything there. He said the calls did not appear to be a precursor to any specific event. They simply happened every few years, and the ranger who received them wrote them down, and life went on. He also said that in the late 1970s, 2 rangers at the station had decided to investigate. They had taken the call seriously, on the assumption that it was a legitimate emergency that the recording equipment had failed to capture, and they had gone up to the area, indicated by the voice, which in that case had been a specific grid reference in the Pitchstone Plateau region. I asked him what they had found. He said they had found nothing. No campsite, no people, no sign that anyone had been in the area. They had walked the grid for most of a day, and they had come back to the station empty-handed, and they had both made entries in the back log describing the search. I asked him whether the 2 rangers had reported any other unusual experiences during the search. Hal was quiet for a moment. Then he said that one of them, a man named Boyd, had written in his entry that during the walk back to the station, he had heard footsteps behind him on the trail for approximately 40 minutes. The footsteps had matched his pace exactly. When he had stopped to listen, the footsteps had stopped. When he had walked again, the footsteps had resumed. He had never seen anyone. He had never heard a voice. The footsteps had simply followed him for 40 minutes, and then as he came within sight of the station road, they had stopped and had not resumed. Boyd had left the Park Service the following spring. Hal said he had not stayed in touch. The other ranger, a woman named Ramsey, had transferred to a station in Wyoming the next year. Hal said she had retired in the early 1990s and was, as far as he knew, still living somewhere in the western part of that state. I asked Hal whether he thought we should report any of this through official channels. He said no. He said that the backlog existed for a reason, and that the reason was that there were things rangers experienced in the course of their work that did not fit into the categories the Park Service had for them. He said that taking these experiences into the official record would not result in better understanding or in better policy. It would simply result in the people who reported them being quietly transferred to less interesting postings. He said the backlog was the right place for these observations. He said it had been the right place for them for almost 30 years, and that it would continue to be the right place for them for as long as the station existed. I worked the rest of that season without incident. I did not receive any more calls. Lee did not receive any. Hal did not receive any. The radio was quiet through the end of October, when the season closed and the station was secured for winter. I did not return to the station in 2000. I had been accepted into a graduate program in Oregon, and I left Park Service work for what I thought at the time was a temporary career change. It turned out to be permanent. I have been in academic forestry for almost 25 years now, but I have kept in touch with Lee. She continued at the station for 2 more seasons before she also moved on. She is now retired from the Park Service and lives in a small town in Montana. We exchange letters, the old-fashioned kind, 2 or 3 times a year. In one of her letters, about 10 years ago, she told me something that I have thought about often since. She said that during her final summer at the station in 2001, she had been on dispatch one night in early September, and she had received a call on the South District frequency at approximately 2:40 in the morning. The voice had been male. The voice had been calm. The voice had asked her to come up to the campsite, and the voice had used her name. She had not responded. She had sat at the desk for a long time, and she had not keyed the mic, and she had not woken anyone in the back. She had waited for the carrier hum to return, and when it had returned, she had stood up, and she had walked to the back room, and she had taken the backlog down off the shelf. She had made her entry. She had signed her name. She had put the book back. She wrote in her letter that as she was closing the backlog, she had glanced at the shelf where it was kept, and she had noticed that the dust on the shelf around the book was disturbed, as if the book had been moved recently. She had not moved it since the previous winter. No one else at the station, to her knowledge, had any reason to handle it. She wrote that the dust pattern was the kind of pattern that would be left by a hand reaching in, taking the book down, and placing it back. The kind of pattern a person leaves on a shelf when they have been reading. She did not know whose hand it was. She did not ask the other rangers about it. She simply made a note in the back log about the dust, and signed her name and closed the book. I have thought in the years since about what the backlog was actually for. When Hal first showed it to me, he described it as a record, a place to write down observations that did not fit into the official structure, a way of leaving notes for the rangers who would come after us, so that they would not feel alone the first time they encountered something they could not explain. I believed that at the time. I still believe it mostly, but I have wondered sometimes whether the backlog was something more than a record, whether it was, in some way, a kind of conversation, whether the entries we made in it, signing our names and dating them and writing down what we had heard, were being read by someone or something that knew where the book was kept. I do not have an answer to that question. I am a careful person, and I am not given to dramatic interpretations of things I do not understand. The backlog may simply be what Hal said it was, a record, an inheritance, a quiet acknowledgement that wilderness work involves experiences that the official paperwork has no place for. But I think about Lee's letter sometimes. I think about the dust on the shelf, disturbed in the pattern of a hand. I think about my own entry, signed with my own name, dated September the 23rd of 1999, sitting in a green canvas-bound ledger in a back room of a ranger station in the South District of Yellowstone. I think about how many people, over the years, have read what I wrote, and I think occasionally about how at least one of them never gave me a name.